Nodar, welcome to whatever this is. This the entire idea for this conversation came from when I asked you what philosophy you have. Are you an absurdist? Are you an existentialist? Are you a nihilist? What are you? And you said you have a bit more of a continental philosophy. What does that mean? What is continental philosophy?
Excellent question. Actually, this conversation, yeah, you're exactly right, came when you asked me a question, precisely what is my philosophy, a question that I answered that I have my own philosophical enterprise. And to be more precise, I am a continental philosopher.
Yeah.
As we all know, in 20th century, Western intellectual tradition got divided in three separate intellectual traditions. One is American pragmatic, other British analytical tradition, and the last but not least, continental European tradition of thought. Personally, I belong to a continental tradition. My work belongs to continental tradition. And specifically, my philosophical enterprise is best elucidated in the first part of my philosophical project, which goes by the title of Principia Ontologia. And it is neither existentialist, nor absurdist, or nor nihilist. It is an exclusively continental enterprise, which the mission of which is to catalyze advancement in the tradition through traversing the territory its predecessors wanted to Bakradze. So I conceive my philosophical enterprise, which I call Principia Ontologia, as a separate, as a new cutting-edge philosophical path that can accomplish what its forerunners wanted to, but unfortunately, owing to the limitations I highlight in my writings, they could not. So in that sense, this is the best way to explain it. This is what I like to describe as continental postmodern thought.
Postmodern. Okay.
Yeah, my goal is to catalyze the advent of the first ever postmodern continental enterprise. So as we all know, Western intellectual tradition moves historically from pre-modern, modern to postmodern epochs. And long story short, when it comes to what Jürgen Habermas describes as a philosophical discourse of modernity and the goal of overcoming what Mr. Habermas calls philosophy of consciousness, both pre-modern, modern, and postmodern epochs have unfortunately failed. So in my opinion, in order for us to succeed in catalyzing advancement within Western intellectual tradition, which whereby catalyze the flourishing of authentically post-metaphysical thinking, we need to move from postmodern to postmodern continental thought, which, as I end my first part, will be what my beloved predecessor, Ken Wilber, describes as all quadrant, all level continental enterprise, which the first ever continental enterprise, which is truly all quadrant, all level, that is my own Principia Ontologia. So in that sense, to answer your question, to summarize my answer is that I'm a continental philosopher with my own unique philosophical enterprise, unique in a sense that it has novel insights, but obviously I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, and without the contributions of my beloved predecessors, ranging from Martin Heidegger to Jacques Derrida to Jürgen Habermas to Ken Wilber, not to mention other brilliant Occidental thinkers whose shadow falls on my writings every page, ranging from Nietzsche, Bataille, Foucault to other modern and pre-modern thinkers. Obviously, all of this would be impossible. Nonetheless, it preserves all the invaluable insights of my forerunners, while also taking the discourse further in order to facilitate advancement. And this is a feature, not the bug, of in my opinion, authentic continental philosophy.
Okay. How old are you, by the way?
I'm 22. I'm 22. That's actually a very good question
Yeah.
because
Because when did you start getting into philosophy? You're like at a pretty high level. If we look at your Instagram posts, you use very complex language that very few people would be able to truly appreciate. So how long did it take you to get to this level? Did you start when you were a teenager, in your early teens, late teens?
I actually first when I was 14, around in my early teenage years, I first
Yeah.
got into personal development, and I was reading a lot of personal development books.
Hmm.
Also, other than personal development, in my early to mid to late teenage years, I read quite a bit of Eastern philosophy other than self-help material, which
Yeah.
allowed me to build a strong foundation of a theoretical understanding of uh, what Abraham Maslow would call to live a self-actualized life.
Hmm.
And uh, at the age of 18, I
Yeah.
took I took a personal development course, which I consider to be one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, personal development resources ever.
Hmm.
Leo Gura's life purpose course. Leo
Okay.
Gura is I think, the best personal development teacher on the planet. He has a platform called actualize.org. And on the platform, he has this course called Life Purpose Course. And I
Yeah.
took, like took quite a bit of courses from
Yeah.
various personal development teachers.
Hmm.
And I found that course to be the most powerful. And in that course, I was able to get clear on my purpose, what Robert Greene would call life's task. And
Yeah.
from the age of 18, I started to I identified my life purpose as a continental philosopher, and I dedicated my work to Western philosophy. And later, after years and hundreds of hours of independent contemplation, coupled with scrupulous reading and research,
Yeah.
I was able to arrive at my own philosophical enterprise, which is obviously in work in progress.
Hmm. Okay. You touch a bit on ontology in your work. Now, ontology, in my opinion, like the best way to describe it is like the branch of metaphysics that focuses on the nature of being. Now, I've been intrigued. Metaphysics has intrigued me for a very long time, but
Yeah,
I do not really know where to start. How
yeah,
did you first get into metaphysics? Because it's such a dense field, so complex,
yeah,
so complicated to begin with. It's like an insurmountable giant. So how would
yeah,
you recommend people get into metaphysics? Because from what I've heard, it's definitely worth it. It's like a
yeah,
supreme level of thought. Um, a supreme level of thought goes into it all, and
yeah.
yeah, it's like a good field to study. How would you recommend people get into metaphysics?
That's actually an interesting question because right now, akin to my predecessors, we in modern Western tradition, we employ the word metaphysics in a pejorative sense. It's like metaphysics is something we want to overcome and prevail over. Because
Yeah.
as Campbell highlights, and Jürgen Habermas also highlights, after Immanuel Kant and his critique of pure reason, metaphysics metaphysics is died. And
Hmm.
after with the advent of Hegel's enterprise, we are working on overcoming what can be described as metaphysical path.
Hmm.
However, what in your question, the expression metaphysics is not used in a pejorative sense.
Hmm.
So in that sense, in order to answer your question, how to get into metaphysics is like that would be the study of being,
Yeah.
and the study of being, more specifically, we call ontology.
Ontology. So start
And
with ontology.
yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Okay.
When it comes to ontology, obviously, as Martin Heidegger highlights, the roots of ontology is obviously pre-modern ancient Greek thought. When the first, as Heidegger himself says, when the first thinker asked himself a pivotal question, summoned enough courage and audacity and open-mindedness to ask the question, what is being? And as Heidegger says, there's a precise moment where the first thinker experiences the unconcealment, the truth of being for the first time. However, more specifically, ontology starts with ancient Greek thinkers such as Heraclitus and Parmenides, more specifically, pre-Socratic intellectuals. However, as Heidegger interprets Western intellectual tradition, and as I also interpret Western intellectual tradition, the history of it, a controversial idea that many people won't agree with me upon, but still, as Heidegger highlights, with the rise of Plato's enterprise, and more specifically Aristotle's enterprise, the
Yeah.
question of being and ontological inquiry got neglected and disregarded because Aristotle, Plato side by side with Aristotle, and the plethora of other thinkers can commit what we can describe as fundamental ontological error, which means that instead of focusing on being, the truth of being, what can be also primordial ground of existence, which allows every other entity to arise, Aristotle and the company focus simply on beings, i.e., entities in existence, instead of focusing on the unconcealment where every other entity arises. And in this, and since Alfred of Whitehead, to use Alfred of Whitehead's famous quote, as Whitehead remarked, the safest characterization of Western European thought is that it is footnotes to Plato. And Heidegger,
Yeah. Yeah. Because I was in Latin class in like seventh grade last year, and our teacher was explaining to us how basically Socrates taught Plato, and Plato taught Aristotle, and that was kind of like the origin of Western philosophy in one way, in a very oversimplified way. And I was asking to myself, if it all originated from those big three, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, is all of Western knowledge, all of Western philosophy, able to be brought back to those three? Are they like the origin of all Western thought? That's so yeah. Everything being a footnote to Plato is that's an incredible idea, and in a lot of ways true. But at the same time, why not a footnote to Socrates if he didn't write anything? But
so that was Whitehead's safe generalization that Western thought is a footnote to Plato.
Yeah.
However, akin to Heidegger, I also have a problem with those footnotes because, according to me and according to my predecessors, especially Martin Heidegger, these footnotes, it doesn't matter if footnotes to Aristotle, footnotes to Plato, to footnotes or Socrates, equally, they commit the error of paying exclusive attention to beings and not enough attention to being. And consequently, as a result, subsequent to Aristotle, Western intellectual tradition totally neglected ontological inquiry, which is why Martin Heidegger commences his 1927 magnum opus, Being and Time, with the words that the question of being today has been forgotten. So he has no choice but to do that because the ontological inquiry has been neglected by footnotes to Plato. So to answer the question how to start studying ontology,
Metaphysics and ontology, yeah.
What specifically Martin Heidegger in his 927 Being and Time described as fundamental ontology, i.e., ontology which doesn't simply inquire into nature of numerous entities and their characteristics, but inquires into the truth of being that grounds these entities, which is a unconcealment where these beings arise, i.e., fundamental ontological inquiry. Excellent place to start is obviously Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, because even through, as I highlight, Martin Heidegger, unfortunately, could not bring the ontological torch to its destination, both in his earlier and later thought. Without a doubt, Martin Heidegger saved and rescued and revived fundamental ontological inquiry with his classic Being and Time. So when it comes to starting with studying fundamental ontological inquiry and ontology as a whole, the excellent place to start is, of course, Martin Heidegger's body of work.
Okay, perfect. So the best way to start learning metaphysics is ontology, and learning about ontology, and the greatest way to start learn, and the best way of starting to learn about ontology is Martin Heidegger's Being and Time. That's like
indeed, and afterwards,
okay.
so you can Martin Heidegger obviously revives and rescues fundamental ontological inquiry. However, he is unable to bring the torch to his destination owing to various reasons. His enterprise is what I like to call a beautifully failed enterprise. Itself, Being a Time, I describe as a beautiful failure. So my goal is to bring the ontological torch to its destination. And as a result, the first part of my project already catalyzed important advancement. So you can begin with Martin Heidegger, and afterward also as an introduction to postmodern fundamental ontological inquiry, individuals can read Principia Ontologia, and I think they will find value, doing both at the same time or after each other.
Okay. You said you read a little bit of Eastern philosophy when you were younger?
Yes.
Yes. How do you think it's different in what ways is it different from Western philosophy? Because, of course, Western and Eastern cultures are very different. Even Eastern culture, if we're comparing, I don't know, Saudi Arabia to Japan, it's completely different. But there's that main distinction between the West and the East. What makes the Western philosophy, so different?
That's a very good question. And
Thanks.
I cannot, I'll lie to, it would be a lie if I say that I have very extensive knowledge of Eastern tradition and Eastern tradition. However, for example, Mr. Kenruba has an extensive knowledge of both Western and Eastern philosophical traditions. He's a very unparalleled knowledge of both traditions. And based on Kenruba's writings, and also my impression of Eastern thought is that unlike Western intellectual tradition, Eastern philosophical thought, it doesn't really have a lineage. What I mean by that, for example, if let's say you want to understand Hegel, if you understand Hegel, it would be amazing and
what came before.
To read Immanuel Kant. If you want to understand the thinker behind Western intellectuals' Copernican revolution, it would be very valuable to read the works of a thinker who woken up the Immanuel from his sleep and drowsiness, i.e., David Hume. In order to understand David Hume, it will be valuable to understand George Berkeley. In order to understand George Berkeley, it will be valuable to understand John Locke. And we'll go all the way back to Plato and Socrates. And in order to
Okay.
understand Socrates, it will be valuable if you understand Parmenides and all the way
Yes.
back.
Hmm.
The same point
Yeah.
does not apply to Eastern thinkers. Where when I was reading Eastern philosophy, I felt like you don't really need to understand. If you want to understand Lao Tzu, you don't really have to understand someone like Mahatma Gandhi or Buddha or any other Eastern thinker. You can simply study Lao Tzu and he will deliver his insight without any help of any other thinker.
Hmm.
So also, that's in my opinion, a huge difference where Eastern thinkers, all of them are doing what they want to do without talking about their predecessors or even contemporaries. So
Hmm.
that's a huge
Okay.
difference.
That's a really interesting idea. So you're saying that Western philosophy kind of has a lineage from Plato to, I don't know, to Hume, to Kant, to Camus, to stuff like that. There's an
Yeah.
entire history that you need to learn to fully appreciate later works. And with Eastern philosophy, every single work is kind of its independent project and has its independent beauty, and you don't need a lot of previous lecture, right?
Yeah.
What do you think is better? Because, for example, if you this happens in literature as well. If you want to read Ulysses by James Joyce, one of the hardest books of all time, you need to
Yeah.
have read Shakespeare. You need to have read a couple of other Joyce's works. So many you need to have read maybe Moby Dick in one way or another, Homer, of course, because to understand the Homerian parallels, stuff like that. Does having to read things before reading something make the work a lot richer, or is it kind of an inconvenient thing you need to go through to actually fully appreciate a work?
That's a very, yeah, I mean, it has both ways has own advantages and disadvantages.
Hmm.
Personally, if I had to choose, I enjoy the fact that Western intellectual traditions has a lineage
Yeah.
because that now allows me as a contemporary Western philosopher to come and honor my beloved predecessors and continue the lineage,
Hmm.
which is in my opinion, a wonderful and a fascinating opportunity as a continental philosopher that I can honor my predecessors through picking up the torch and exploring the territory they, for various reasons, weren't able to explore.
Hmm.
However, when it comes to Eastern thought, I had an impression that the major cause behind why Eastern thinkers do not really have a lineage is because all of them have most of them revolve around one major insight, which can what can be described as what would be best way to put it, a intuition of post-rational levels of development, what in Western psychology is known as transpersonal psychology, i.e., Eastern
Yeah.
philosophers were excellent at attuning themselves and accessing post-rational phases of development. Obviously, I'm not saying they were freed from philosophy of consciousness or anything like that. However,
Hmm.
when it comes to phenomenological practice, when it comes to a post-rational insight and moving beyond reason in a sense of accessing what in Zen, for example, they call Satori,
Hmm.
Eastern philosophers were quite proficient at doing that. So
Hmm.
since they have this one insight, which in Zen is called Satori, in other traditions there's various different names, they specifically because they revolve around specifically that insight, they do not need to talk about their predecessors or their contemporaries. So in
Hmm.
that sense, if I only want to talk about one insight, I would not have to talk about my lineage or my predecessors. However, us as Western intellectuals, we are not in the business of simply talk about one insight. We are,
Hmm.
our horizon is much more expansive than one transpersonal insight. which obviously is very important. However, on its own is incapable of overcoming philosophy of consciousness. Akin to how without post-rational development, you cannot overcome philosophy of consciousness. Simply with transpersonal and post-rational insight, you can also never overcome philosophy of consciousness. So to answer your question more specifically, in my opinion, having predecessors and having your knowledge quest more expansive is, at the end of the day, if done correctly, is much more powerful and can lead to much more powerful result than simply having no lineage and simply focusing on one insight. But at the end of the day, has no choice but to disavow either intersubjective, objective, or interobjective phenomena, which there is no need to be some Eastern philosophy expert. Eastern philosophers, at the end of the day, are not all quadrants in all domain. Even for more often than not, are like Plotinus all level.
Okay, yeah. Because sometimes I sit down and think, after I finish reading all of Shakespeare, after I finish reading the Homeric epics, how good is it going? How pleasant is Ulysses going to be? How interesting is it going to be to understand everything, all of the parallels, all of the references, because I have read previously. And I think that's really the beautiful thing about Western philosophy, that it's like a building. It's like the Empire State Building. It builds, each philosopher builds upon what the other had to say. And now that I mentioned philosophers, how do you think philosophers and their philosophies and their philosophical works influence politics? For example, do you think Germany has had its history and its politics and whatever because of its philosophers? France, its history, its revolutions, its culture because of its philosophers. Romania, Spain, Georgia, Russia because of its philosophers. Did Dostoevsky change anything about the Russian way of life or Russian ideology? How do you think this plays into politics?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I mean, specifically, the best way to one most people answer the question that philosophy has no influence over politics. It's abstract. What they call, to excuse my, this is actual term many people use. It's a mental masturbation.
Yeah.
However, very, very strong an idea of love of wisdom, which totally misses the point. In my opinion, Western philosophers, as Bertrand Russell proved in his classic History of Western Philosophy, which was specifically written with a political motive, that he wanted to elucidate the connection between philosophies and political situations in pre-modern, modern epochs. Inescapably, philosophers, and more specifically, political philosophers, eventually, one way or another, have undeniable influence on political situation in history of Western countries.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, to take modernity as an example, modernity was the greatest dignity of modernity, as Max Weber highlighted, was what can be described as the differentiation of value spheres, which means that when in the rise of modernity, the first time in history, art, morals, and science were able to pursue their investigation independently without mythic, literal, religious churchmen coming and telling, for example, scientists that they could not look into the telescope because the Bible is not talking about telescopes. So you better put away your telescope, buddy, or something bad gonna happen because Bible doesn't say so.
Yeah.
Same thing happened to thinkers, philosophers, artists, and everyone in between, because fundamentally value spheres were indissociated. However, with the rise of modernity, first time in history we have seen the value sphere differentiation, which allows philosophers and scientists to pursue their investigation independently. All of a sudden, Voltaire was not supposed to write whatever Charles wanted to write. He could write about liberal democracy, liberation movements, and the imperativeness of overcoming mythic, ethnocentric thought with its monarchy and other mechanisms of power. And modernity is an excellent example where freed and emancipated Western philosophers have direct influence over political events, which manifest themselves eventually in French Revolution and other revolutions, which led to the rise of liberal democracies, which led to the rise of women's liberation movements, which led to the rise of eventual abolition of slavery and other valuable dignities that came from modernity. So in that sense, as modernity exemplified, Western philosophers have an imperative influence, a very important influence on social and cultural phenomena and manifestation inescapably.
Yeah, and I think that's an undeniable fact. For me, politics and philosophy are so closely related. They're like siblings because presidents, parliaments, the government basically decides what is right or wrong based on a code of ethics. They have a code of ethics. Religion absolutely has determined politics and culture, of course, and religion itself. We can consider religion a philosophy. Do you agree with that?
Religion,
As a philosophy.
consider religion is a philosophy is a little bit difficult because there's so many meanings of the expression religion.
I don't know. Let's just take Christianity. Do you think Christianity itself is a religion? For me, it absolutely is. If you think there is a God and if something kind of determines your worldview, how you act, your ethics, it definitely can count as a religion, just like as a philosophy, like absurdism or nihilism or existentialism or I don't know any other philosophy. So for me, religion definitely is a philosophy in general, is a branch, is a category of philosophy that includes many little philosophies.
Indeed, come back to your question about how philosophy influences politics and vice versa.
Yeah.
Maybe why politics influence philosophy, philosophy influences politics, and vice versa, is because fundamentally, as Canuba beautifully displayed, inescapably there exists, when it comes to human existence, what can be described as subjective, intersubjective, objective, and interobjective domains. What can also be understood as intentional, behavioral, cultural, and social domains with their own unique phenomenology and phenomena. And if we obviously we don't have time to get into this extremely deep discussion. However, to put it very briefly, if we carefully study the history of Western intellectual tradition and even Eastern intellectual tradition, if we simply study carefully the history of human knowledge quest cross-cultural, inescapably we are going to find investigators who primarily focus on investigating subjective and intersubjective phenomena, i.e., focusing on either on introspection or an interpretation. However, at the same time, we are going to find a whole bunch of researchers who focus their entire lives on investigating objective and interobjective phenomena, i.e., classical positivists, behaviorists, Marxists, etc. All of that is a study of objective and interobjective phenomena. So in that sense, we can arrive at very certain conclusion that intentional, behavioral, cultural, and social domains are inescapable, and no amount of cultural constructivism and postmodernism gone wrong can annihilate these four quadrants. And most importantly, these four quadrants are not disembodied and totally disconnected from one another. Every subjective, intersubjective experience and phenomena has an objective and interobjective correlation, which allows us to arrive at the conclusion that the four domains of intentional, behavioral, cultural, and social tetra arise, and they all influence one another. So in that sense, if one understands philosophy as a, let's say, intersubjective contribution,
Yeah.
interobjective, what Marx would call interobjective mode of production, will inescapably influence an intersubjective cultural production and vice versa. Intersubjective cultural production will have inevitable influence on social phenomena and manifestation, because fundamentally these are all correlated and they are all connected with one another. So in that sense, all of these are deeply connected. In order to truly develop a all quadrant, all domain, or all level postmodern thought, it is imperative to honor what Plato would call the true, the good, and the beautiful, i.e.,
Yes.
intersubjective, objective, and interobjective, art, morals, and science, self, culture, and nature in equal measure. We need to honor this in equal measure, otherwise our thinking will be less than adequate, it will be less than graceful, it will be less than inclusive. And less than inclusive thinking, as history showed, leads to less than pleasant results.
Wow. Yeah, very, very well articulated, Nodar. Now, let's move to something a little bit more light and fun. Your favorite philosophers and works. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'll start with the question. I don't want to put you on the spot, but what are your favorite philosophical works? What would be your like top three? The ones you keep revisiting, the ones that most changed your view of philosophy, the ones who most influenced Principia Ontologia.
Yeah. So actually, my Principia Ontologia is dedicated to my four predecessors: Martin Heidegger, Jürgen
Yeah.
Habermas, Jacques Derrida, and Ken Wilber. So the first out of the three books which influenced me the most, the first obviously will be the specific predecessor of Principia Ontologia, of course, Martin Heidegger's Being and Time.
Being in Time, of course.
Of course, it totally revolutionized my entire life, my thought, and Principia Ontologia without Being and Time would be totally impossible. And so obviously, needless to say, the first book I'm going to go with is Martin Heidegger's Being and Time. Other than Being and Time, I'm going to make a controversial statement, because if you ask most teachers of philosophy what is the greatest, one of the most important books of 20th century Western philosophy, even if they hate Heidegger, they would say Being and Time, and eventually they would say something along the lines of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus or Philosophical Investigations. They will not say Ken Wilber's 1995 magnum opus, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality. However, I consider Ken Wilber's magnum opus, 1995, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, to be one of the most important contributions of 20th century Western philosophy. So as a second book, I would definitely go with Ken Wilber's masterpiece, where he achieves an unparalleled advancement within tradition, the major breakthroughs of which I integrate in my own philosophical enterprise for the purpose of catalyzing advancement, specifically within continental thought. So other than Being and Time and Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, the third spot, when it comes to my favorites, I would go with, again, a controversial take, but since it is my favorite, we are talking about my favorites and not specifically the most influential.
Yeah.
I would go with,
It's your subjective opinion, yes.
yeah, what influenced me most profoundly would be Jürgen Habermas's 1995 philosophical discourse of modernity, where Habermas engages as an active participant, as a member of Western philosophical discourse of modernity. He actively reconstructs and deconstructs Western thought, starting from Hegel, until down to Derrida, Foucault, and post-modern, post-structuralist thought. And in my opinion, what Habermas accomplished in span of those 385 pages is nothing short of revolutionary. It's tremendous. When I read the book, and not to mention overall Jürgen Habermas' contribution, it totally revolutionized my entire thinking. It took me to the next level. And the advancement I was able to catalyze within principal ontologia would be impossible without Habermas's work. And also, obviously, philosophical discourse of modernity, where, for example, he engages in a painstaking destructuring and deconstructive effort with reference to Martin Heidegger's oeuvre, and also he actively deconstructs Jacques Derrida, highlighting their blind spots and partial conclusions. And as a thinker who wants to catalyze advancement, I derive invaluable insights from Habermas's deconstructive maneuvers on my other predecessors. And at the same time, also his own blind spots and mistakes. So in that sense, when it comes to my favorite books, my three favorite books, I would go with Heidegger's Being and Time, Campbell's Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, and Habermas' Philosophical Discourse of Modernity. But if I was honest, it's really hard to choose one book because Heidegger's oeuvre is so rich. He has other invaluable writings which are equally, and at certain times, even more important than Being and Time. Same with Ken Wilber. Wilber has written other invaluable masterpieces, which are certain even more important than Sex, Ecology, Spirituality. And not to mention Habermas, whose major book is not Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, but Theory of Communicative Action. However, since I had to choose specific books, I would unfortunately would have to go with those, not entirely.
Now, you already recommended Being in Time as like the entry point to ontology and metaphysics generally. Would you recommend the other two works for beginners in philosophy?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean,
wait. Let me. When it comes to beginners, starting Being in Time and Philosophical Discourse and Habermas' work is quite complex.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, if you're getting into metaphysics, you already need to have like a good base in other things.
However,
Ken
has more accessible writings. So if someone is a beginner, I would advise them to read, for example, Ken Wilber's Brief History of Everything, which is written in an extremely accessible fashion, in a common tone. However, it contains an invaluable philosophical depth. So if a beginner, out of 3 books, I would advise them to read Ken Wilber's writings, because he's a very eloquent writer.
Perfect. Is there any philosopher you strongly disagree with? Any philosopher whose works you just look at and say, this guy has no idea what he's talking about?
Oh yeah, but sometimes I have that tendency. Obviously, in my philosophical enterprise, I engage in very active, deconstructive and destructuring expeditions.
Yeah.
Where I have strong disagreements, for example, with my predecessor Jacques Derrida's animal ontology, and I actively deconstruct Derrida's Derridian animal ontology. However, I do not get that impression that this guy is obviously totally wrong. The only person, the modern thinker I had an impression that he was like totally wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but not like really, he really went left, went south, was Richard Rorty, an American philosopher, American pragmatist, who I don't even specifically discuss in my writings because the mistakes he makes, he essentially engages in a form of a cultural constructivism and cultural relativism disguised under the banner of American pragmatism. I'm not saying the entirety of Rorty's oeuvre is useless. However, for me, when I was reading Rorty, he was an example of totally structurally unconscious, totally not at all constructed aware, literal antithesis of authentically postmodern thought. So if I had to choose a thinker which specifically arose that feeling in me that he went totally wrong, and I learned a valuable lesson on what not to do, it would be Richard Rorty.
Wow. Okay. An invaluable lesson of what not to do. That's a great way to put it. Wow. I looked at like your Instagram profile and saw that there were two philosophers that came up more often than others. Tell me if you agree or if I like misread it. Dostoevsky and Kant. You've made content about
Yeah,
Kant, especially. Yeah.
I made a video about Dostoevsky as well,
Yeah.
obvious thinker behind Copernican Revolution, but I cannot say I made the most videos about them. I
Mhm.
made videos about, to be told, I cannot say I specifically made videos about one thinker. I made
Yeah. Mhm.
about quite a bit of Occidental thinkers. But however, you are terribly correct. I made content about both Dostoevsky and Immanuel Kant. Yes.
Mhm. Okay. By the way, I hope this isn't an insensitive question. Being from Georgia, do you speak Russian or not?
Indeed, I speak
You do
Russian.
speak Russian. Now, my question for you is, do you read the main Russian philosophers in their original language? Do you read them in Russian or English?
Oh,
Yeah.
it's true. From in my school, they taught us the school I finished from 1 to 12th grade. They taught us Russian from the first grade,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, even if that's the case, my Russian is not that good. The problem is when
Yeah.
I can have a conversation in Russian
Hmm.
when other person is talking with me in Russian, I understand everything they say. However,
Yeah.
my grammar is bad, and
Hmm.
I make grammatical mistakes, and also my vocabulary in Russian is not that good. So in that sense, I haven't read any writings of Russian philosophers in Russian because my Russian is not good enough for that. So,
Yeah.
but
Um, yeah.
what the question? I'd say,
Yeah, I asked because, for example, when I wanted to get into absurdism, I first spent about like 2 or 3 months to learn basic French so that I could read *The Stranger* by Camus, and
oh,
I think it helped. I'm not sure. The English translation is also okay. The English translation, in my opinion, is kind of bad. So
yeah,
I'm
wow.
yeah, I'm proud of myself for learning French for that reason, and now I can like also speak French in other contexts, and that's why I was curious because reading things in their original language is so important to me. I would
Yeah,
genuinely learn Russian to read Russian philosophy.
I actually remember watching your video, which had a great impression on me. I watched quite a bit of your videos, which all impressed me. One of the videos, someone asked you, but can you make a short video where you talk in different languages?
Yeah.
And if
Hmm.
I'm not mistaken, you were able to talk in Romanian,
Hmm.
French, English, German, and Spanish?
Yeah, Spanish. Romanian and Spanish are like my native languages. I was born in Romania, here in Bucharest. I've spent
Yeah.
my entire life here, but my father is from Barcelona, so I learned the languages like at the same time, straight out of the womb.
Oh, yeah.
So,
And I was
yeah,
truly impressed with your,
yeah.
it's, it's amazing.
Thanks, thanks. It means a lot, and also with German for philosophy, German is even more important than French. Heidegger, he wrote in German. Kant wrote in German, right? He's German.
Yeah.
Kant, yeah, he wrote in German. So many others wrote in German. I'm having a moment of lapses, but so many Nietzsche wrote in German. So many important German philosophers, and being able to speak German and appreciate them in their native in their original language would be so important for me. But I do not have that level in German yet. Yeah.
Languages, which is amazing. Something I cannot say about myself. I don't have a natural talent in learning languages, and I think that's an invaluable skill.
Yeah. Thanks. That's why I ask. I think it's really important. But okay, one of my final questions. If you were to bring, if you would be able to bring a philosopher back to life and ask him a question, which philosopher would that be?
Oh, yeah. I thought about that quite a bit.
It's a popular question. Some people have like a very clear answer. Others have a lot of different options. They don't know what to choose from. So,
I would
Nodar,
not, I would
who
not,
who would you choose?
I would not say I would ask a question, but I would bring my the master Algerian French grammatologist Jacques Derrida back to life. He passed
Okay.
in I think 2002. It's our yeah. He passed away either in 2002 or 2003.
Yeah.
And
Right before you were to be born, right?
yeah,
Or
indeed, I
yeah,
was born
yeah. You
on 20.
barely missed them. You barely missed them. Yeah.
Instead of I thought about what would be Jacques Derrida's reaction to my deconstruction of his text, because at the same time I actually wrote this in Principia Ontologia that Jacques Derrida would love me and hate me at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, that happens. Yeah, I
Yet
can understand that.
I try to honor his Nietzschean free spirit through engaging in my own deconstructive expeditions. So without
Yeah.
their deconstruction, my deconstruction would be impossible. However, at the same time, he would hate me because I arrive at conclusions which Derrida would not be particularly fond of. So
Yeah.
even interesting if me and Derrida could debate, how would the debate end? What would be reaction towards me? So to answer that question, I would go with Jacques Derrida.
Okay. Now, for my final question, how do you go about building your own philosophical enterprise? How do you go about building your own philosophical system of belief? It's a dense one, but I think you're like one of the greatest people to ask that to, with considering your work so far.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there is a magic formula to what I'm doing. It's all based on a very definiteness of purpose,
Yeah.
having a very definite, what Robert Greene calls life's task.
Hmm.
And based on that, on a very concrete and specific mission and a life
Yeah.
purpose. The key for me, like to any other individual who pursues their purpose, doesn't matter in what area of their life. It might be business, relationships, and other scientific endeavor. It's about self-discipline and what in psychology and personal development they call deliberate practice. And I'll be honest, I try to, as I've said, like you, I'm very passionate about personal development. And
Hmm.
my early and mid teenage years, I read personal development books.
Yeah.
And I was able to start pursuing my life purpose based on implementing the principles I learned in life-changing personal development books, such as Robert Greene's Master. And based on those principles of deliberate practice, self-discipline, showing up, doing the work, specifically when you don't feel like it, that's the key. When you don't feel like it, that's the moment you need to show up and do the work. And that's other principles of living a life purpose-aligned life. I'm able to honor my philosophical mission and enterprise. And other than that big picture principles, the very specific way I'm building my own philosophical enterprise is through an array of deconstructive and reconstructive expeditions and maneuvers, coupled with a meticulous study of Western intellectual canon, writings of my predecessors, coupled with my own independent contemplation and thinking. When we all of this together, independent contemplation, careful study of Western canon, rigorous deconstructive expeditions, coupled with supported by careful reconstruction of invaluable Occidental concepts and insights, the final outcome is an enterprise which can catalyze advancement within magnificent Western intellectual tradition. In all honesty, what I'm doing is nothing really special. This is what other Occidental thinkers who are able to catalyze advancement within tradition has done. I'm doing, in a sense, I'm not doing anything new. Every single thinker who was able in Western thought was able to facilitate advancement was standing on the shoulder of giants. All of them had no other choice but to, in one way or another, interrogate writings of their predecessors and also cultivate enough courage to engage in an independent contemplation in order to in order to travel the territory which previously was not explored. And to end my point, as Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote, when you are philosophizing, you have to descend in a primeval chaos and feel at home there. And that's precisely what I cultivate, an ability to descend in a primeval chaos and feel at home there. And that's specifically what every other thing, my great predecessor, who was able to facilitate advancement within Occidental canon, was able to do. They were able to descend in the primeval chaos and feel at home there, overcome fear, and as a result, catalyze advancement.
Nodar, thank you so much.
Thank you. I truly appreciate it. And I just want to say that I think I'm very grateful that I found your YouTube channel, which I came across completely accidentally.
Yeah.
And when I couldn't believe in my eyes that such a young person could be so educated and so immersed in study of literature, philosophy, personal development, politics. I was so impressed that I told all of my friends that look at this guy, what he's doing.
Wow, that's really good to hear. Wow.
Yeah. When we were, it was, this is like this young boy is an example what other young boys and girls should be doing. And I simply, there are many times I wondered, your potential, for your potential, not even sky is the limit. Because right now you can literally become anything you can put your mind to, because you have such a strong foundation. At the age of 14, even through, I was not as educated, as immersed in personal development as you. I was not even close. On top of it, you're disciplined, you are practicing calisthenics, you are truly engaging in what's very inclusive, integral personal development, which will allow you to choose any career path you want, and you will be able to build your life on a very, very strong foundation, to a point where if one day I see Elias as a president of Romania, I would not be surprised.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm
You've made my day. You've made my day, Nodar. Yeah, the sky's the limit for both of us. Yeah.
Seeing your videos and seeing your content truly inspires me, because you are going against odds. Many people will tell you that, hey, you are too young. Why are you talking about this? Go play video games. But
Yeah.
you are like, no, it doesn't matter how old you are. It matters the depth of your courage, the depth of your dedication, and the depth of your insight. And anyone who watches your videos can say that you offer invaluable insights on plethora of topics. And it doesn't matter your age at that point, rather than a liability, becomes an asset. So you truly inspire me, and I want you to continue to dedicate yourself to your life purpose. And I think whatever you're going to choose in future as more specific outlet of your mission and life purpose in life, happens that to be politics or literature or philosophy or any other scientific study, or maybe business and entrepreneurship, I'll be honest, I'm sure that you will be able to positively contribute to other people, change their lives for the better, and influence every person you are going to come across in a positive fashion. So that inspires me, and I appreciate you for that.
Thank you from the bottom of my heart, Nodar. That's one of the most beautiful and one of the most beautiful string of words someone has recently put together for me. So, thanks.
And I'm on.
We'll talk again soon. We'll talk again soon. Good luck with your own philosophical enterprise, and yeah, thanks for coming on. I appreciate you, brother.
Truly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.